Good morning, everybody. It's Coffee Time Bible Study with Kaylee Duvall. How are you, Kaylee?
Good morning. I'm good.
Good morning, Zoom. How are you? Everybody's doing great. And we're ready to begin. So last week, we did our Bible study on the unnamed woman who lived a sinful life. And we were in Luke chapter 7, 36 through 50. We learned about her devotion, her love, her faithfulness, and her humility as she went into the dinner held by Simon the Pharisee and stood behind Jesus, then fell to his feet. We talked about how she washed Jesus's feet with her tears, and she wiped his feet dry with her hair. We also talked about the perfume that she poured on his feet and how the room was filled with the perfume, and all the focus was on Jesus and the unnamed woman with the sinful life. It was no longer the focus on the dinner, and how Jesus was invited to that dinner by the Pharisees to try and trap him into something that he might do or say different than what their law was. So they didn't trap Jesus. What ended up happening was she came in uninvited and basically took over the whole room to give God glory. So she was bold, she was courageous, and she was going to get to Jesus, and nothing was going to stop her. We talked about how she crawled underneath the table and how she was just in awe of our Jesus. And we just thank her for her story. And we give our Father all the praise and glory. Today's study is on the another unnamed woman with the issue of blood. And we will be in Matthew and in Luke for this story. And we'll go back and forth because it gives us more detail. A little bit, Matthew gives us some detail and Luke as well. So we start off where Jesus was still in Capernaum during this time, which was a little small fishing village on the Sea of Galilee. It's important to get this visual story and not just read the story. Some of these chapters of the women are just a small little chapter, but when you really get into the story and visualize just being there and how the conditions were, how the people were, what was happening at the time, it helps you to better understand the story and relate to it because we are them, as Brother Hiawatha says. There was about 1,500 to 3,000 people in this village, and this is where Jesus lived during his ministry. So this was very familiar territory that Jesus was in at this time. And Jesus chose Peter, Andrew, and Matthew from Capernaum and performed many of his miracles there. So it's an important little fishing village. And Jesus was there when he was invited to the Pharisees' dinner in the last week's study. So this whole area is very important with the stories and what was happening at the time. And the unnamed woman lived there as well, as we know. So we start off this study in Leviticus because we have to understand the Jewish law at the time and what that declared for women. So it declared that women were unclean for 7 days after their menstrual cycle. What this meant was that women were not allowed to be in the temple for Jewish religious ceremonies, and also anything or anyone that was touched by a woman during this period of bleeding would be considered unclean as well. And they had a full ritual of going through being clean and what was unclean to the Jewish law, in the Jewish law. In Leviticus, unclean refers to a state of ritual impurity, not moral sin. It's a ritual that they put into their law. Examples could be menstruation, childbirth, seminal emission, contact with the dead, skin diseases, and certain animals. The Jews also argued about the way that John and his disciples baptized because of the washing rituals. We read that the other day. It's in John 3:25, and it was an argument developed between some of John's disciples and a certain Jew over the matter of ceremonial washing when they were baptizing, how they were baptizing, what were they doing, clean versus unclean, and they had that argument. The clean and unclean ritual was something the Jews believed in very strongly, that this was how they maintained their relationship with God and how they approached the Holy Temple. So they had specific rituals that they followed, that they felt were their relationship with God. This ritual was also a way to set the Israelites apart from being unclean Israelites and clean Israelites. Once you became unclean, there was a purification rituals in order to become clean again. And these laws were given to the people by Moses and Aaron. And there's a couple penalties for the law that I found in Numbers. In Numbers 19:20, it tells us, but if those who are unclean do not purify themselves, they must be cut off from the community because they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. So we know that the Lord presence was in the temple where the high priest did all of these sacrifices in order to go in the presence of God in the innermost room of the temple. So in Numbers 19:22, the same chapter, anything that an unclean person touches becomes unclean, and anyone who touches it becomes unclean till evening. So if the woman was walking around in her house and she was had her menstrual cycle, then everything she touched would be unclean, and anyone she touched would be unclean. So that helps us to understand where the woman with the blood issue for 12 years would be struggling here, because she would be considered unclean, and everything that she touched would be unclean. So in the New Testament, Jesus abolished the distinction between clean and unclean animals, and the concept of ritual purity is replaced with spiritual purity through faith in him. Jesus was more concerned about the inward washing rather than the ritual washing of the outward body. So when Jesus came, all that changed of that ritual, that law, and all of that. We're going to turn to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11 through 28. If you could turn there. Hebrews chapter 9, 11 through 28. So we can understand a little bit more. This is the blood of Christ. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. So this tabernacle, as we know, was considered the way of the rituals, the the altars, the sacrifices that they made. So stay with me as we walk through the blood of Christ. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves like they did with the altar sacrifices, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. So they took the blood and the ashes, and they would go around sprinkling the temple with this purification process. And people, if someone died in a tent, for instance, anybody that went into the tent, they would be unclean. So they would have to completely sprinkle the tent and all the belongings if the person died in the tent. That's an example. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our conscience from the acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. So that answers a lot of questions that we have about the people and their sin and how they first were dealing with the law. That was their standard. Now that Jesus came, he's the standard. He's the salvation. He's the blood that cleanses all things. We go on to verse 16. In the case of a will, it is necessary to prove the death of the one who made it. Because a will is enforced only when somebody has died, it never takes effect while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. When Moses had proclaimed every command of the law to all the people, he took the blood of calves together with water, scarlet wool, and branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll and all the people. I didn't know that until I read this in the study. I didn't know that they did this ritual on the tablets as well. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant, which God has commanded you to keep." In the same way, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices. So when they made this temple to represent the temple of God in heaven, they had to go through these sacrifices and this sprinkling of blood. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again. The way the high priest enters the holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world, but he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. We read all that to understand that the temple and the high priest and those rituals, they all went away when Jesus came, but they still had the law in their minds. They still were putting that standard against that law. So we also want to turn to Leviticus so we can understand what that law said. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 25 through 31. Leviticus 15, 25 through 31. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period. And anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and after that, she will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, you must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest is to sacrifice one for a sin offering and the other a burnt offering. In this way, he will make atonement for her before the Lord for the uncleanliness of her discharge. You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanliness for defiling my dwelling place, which is among them. We know now how wrong that was. We know now that through the blood of Christ, we need eternal washing, not the external washing. In the Old Testament, the temple was where God dwelt among the Israelites. But in the New Testament, God dwelt among men. We're going to turn to John chapter 1, 14 through 18. If you could read that for me, Kaylee. For John, regular John, chapter 1, 14 through 18.
I'm just going to say it wasn't necessarily wrong because those were commands from God for them to do.
Yes.
Like, it wasn't that it was wrong. Like, he had his reasoning for it.
Yeah.
It just looks like to us like an overdoing,
Yeah.
But at that time, right, it was instruction by God, so it wasn't that it was wrong. It was just where I can say I am so glad he changed it, because that just seems like a lot of extra work. But he had his reasoning, whatever
Yes. You are correct. Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate it. That's that's what I need.
John 1:14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known."
Amen. So they took this law, and like you said, Kaylee, which is absolutely right, the law came from God. So they took this law very seriously, which meant that the woman with the issue of blood was not able to touch anything or anyone. Otherwise, they would become unclean. She had to be separated from her family and her life. Being isolated was her life. She could not touch her husband. She was likely an outcast. She could not worship at the temple. This also meant that everyone who touched her in the crowd to get to Jesus would have been unclean. Jesus called her daughter. She was the only woman that Jesus called daughter. Jesus called her daughter after she touched his cloak for healing. The term daughter was a sign of love and intimacy with her. It signifies a protective place within the family. She lived in shame, but Jesus did not shame her. Jesus knew that not only would she be healed physically, but she would also be healed from her heart and her soul. Jesus gave her the acceptance that was missing from her life. Imagine feeling unclean for 12 years and no one can help you. No doctors, not your husband, not your children, not your neighbors. But you must follow the law. Like Kaylee said, that was the law. She followed the law and excluded herself from her children and her husband. Because of her faith, Jesus called her daughter. We're going to read in John, 1st chapter, 9 through 13. Kaylee, you should already be there.
Yeah.
If you could read that for me.
Yep. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and through the world was made through him. The world did not recognize him. He came to do that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God.
So we're children of God, and he called her daughter. We know that when we're called daughter in our families, that really touches our heart and means something. When our fathers recognize us as daughters, that's something very special. And Jesus did this for her. In 1 John chapter 3, 1, see what great love the Father has lavished on us. This is 1 John chapter 3, 1. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And all who have this hope in him purify themselves, just as he is pure. So there's that purification of knowing him. During the time of the woman with the issue of blood, Jesus was performing many miracles. The people would gather around him in crowds, pushing him, literally pushing. There were so many people trying to get close to him. Jesus performed many miracles to demonstrate Christ's power and his compassion. Jesus at the time was being rejected by his own people Yet that did not stop him from pushing forward and doing the will of his Father. In Matthew 9:24, it says, "Then Jesus started off with him." So many people were going along with Jesus that they were crowding him from every side. So I want you to visualize this on how what's going on at the time of the woman with the blood issue. These crowds just are massive around him, and he's moving as he's trying to walk. The whole crowd is moving with them. They're from all sides. In Matthew 4:23, it says, Jesus went throughout Galilee. This is the area that he was, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judah, and the region across the Jordan followed him. Imagine put Jesus as he was performing these miracles and going through time after time, healing and seeing all of the people as they were bringing them more and more towards him. The woman with the issue of blood, had suffered for 12 years, bleeding every day, isolated from everyone, spent all her money, and was losing hope until she heard about Jesus. She was determined that regardless, she was going to reach Jesus. She would push through everything that was preventing her from her healing and her Lord. She had already been through 12 years of this condition and believed that Jesus was the answer. The importance of faith in receiving healing made the difference for her. She had hope and was on a mission to touch Jesus's cloak. Jesus, being close enough to touch, was her personal motivation to receive healing from him, to get to her Jesus. She thought, if only I could touch his cloak, I will be healed. She had no doubt. Faith involves trusting in a higher power or divine being, and she trusted Jesus that day. In James 5:15, it tells us, and the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. I noticed in a lot of the scriptures that healing and forgiveness go hand in hand. If you study for yourself the healing and forgiveness, that's such a great topic to study for yourself, because when there's healing, there's also forgiveness in there. So when you forgive, there's also healing. She was counting on this. She was made to feel like she was below everyone else. She wasn't a rich person. She used all her money towards trying to find a cure that she could not use. She was alienated, isolated, felt unclean no matter what she did. 12 years of feeling like you're unclean would have a toll on your mind and your heart. She made her way through the crowd, beyond her boundaries of isolation, beyond her laws, She knew she was not to be there. It was the law to stay away, and beyond what she had never done before. She reached for him, letting all her cares and concerns leave her. Jesus tells the woman after she touched his cloak that her faith has healed her. We read that in Matthew 9:22. Jesus turned and saw her, and he said, "Take heart, daughter," he said, "your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that very moment. She was not trying to make a spectacle of things as these crowds gathered and pushed as if it was a festival. Again, at this time, Jesus was still in Capernaum, the fishing village on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus was heading to Jairus' house when the woman was healed. In this crowd, a man named Jairus pushed through and found Jesus. And he told Jesus that his daughter was dying and he needed Jesus to go heal her. Her healing took place. This is the woman with the issue of blood, took place as Jesus was pushing towards Jairus' house through the crowd to heal his daughter, who was also 12 years old and actively dying. Both Jairus' daughter, once dead, once she died, and the woman with the blood issue were considered unclean. Both represent 12 years and both regarded as daughters. Jairus was a synagogue leader, so his daughter represented the very essence of Jewish culture: high status, money, while the woman who bled for 12 years represented just the opposite. Our Father doesn't show favoritism. He doesn't care if you are Jewish culture with a lot of money, like the little girl, or you're poor, like the woman with the issue of blood. He doesn't look at that as a condition for whether he's going to heal you or not. He doesn't have favoritism. In Job 34:18 through 19, it says, "Is he not the one who says to kings, 'You are worthless,' and to nobles, 'You are wicked,' who shows no partiality to princes and does not favor the rich over the poor? For they are all the work of his hands." And we have to understand everyone, no matter what their condition, no matter what their situation, no matter how we might think this is wrong or that is wrong, or how they act or how they are or anything about them, Jesus did not look at people that way. He says, whether they were rich or poor, for they are all the work of his hands. Romans chapter 2, 9 through 11. Kaylee, if you could read that for me. Romans chapter 2, 9 through 11.
All right, Romans 2:9. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism.
All right, let's go to Acts 10:34. Acts 10:34.
Then Peter began to speak. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism.
Go on.
But accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. You know the
Yep.
message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all.
Amen. So the woman with the issue of blood fell to her feet as she navigated through the crowd, where she was not supposed to touch anyone. Yet she made her way to him, fighting all the odds, because she could have been recognized by the locals. She could have been pushed away by the crowd. And in Luke 8:42, it tells us, as Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. So I want you to have that picture, because Jesus is making his way through the crowd, and it's taking up his time as he's going towards Jairus's house to get through and navigate through this crowd. And it's so thick that it's almost crushing him. This isn't a crowd where she's just kind of, okay, making her way through the crowd. Everything you read is saying this crowd was tight. It was crushing. It was hard to penetrate, but she penetrates the crowd and she reaches him. Jesus gave Jairus 2 commands and a promise. Don't be afraid and just believe, along with a promise that she will be healed. Luke 8:50 tells us that. Don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed. And let's just change the one word. Don't be afraid, just believe, and you will be healed. We prayed for Mother Teresa this morning. I pray that she will be healed. I'm not afraid. I believe, and she will be healed. These commands are so important if it is the will of God. These commands are so important because this is exactly what the woman with the issue of blood did. She was not afraid, and she believed, and she was healed. She was bold, unafraid. She believed that she would be healed once she touched the cloak, and she was. Once Jesus arrived at Jairus' house, instead of Jesus being welcomed, the mourners that were around the house laughed at Jesus. And let's read about that. Mark chapter 5, 36 through 40. Mark chapter 5, 36 through 40. Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child's not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. When Jairus came to the crowd to Jesus and made his way to Jesus, he was shouting, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and alive." So Jesus went with him. We know he pushed through the crowd. We know that he got there. She died in the meantime. And when he got there, all the people laughed at him when he said she's only sleeping. The woman with the issue of blood, while he was going through the crowd, is crawling and pushing her way to the Lord. She's not walking and pushing. They demonstrate in movies her on the ground walking to get the tassel that is hanging from his cloak. And when she does and she's healed, Jesus turns around and he talks to her. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, when he saw the commotion and they laughed, after he put them out, he said, "Get all of this nonsense out of the house." He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with them and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha," which means little girl, "I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around, and she was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. She was dead. She was gone. And he raised her up. And he lets us know also in that moment that she was not dead, but sleeping. And that's important because we've done studies about sleeping and what that means. We're going to turn to Hebrews chapter 10, 22 through 24. Hebrews chapter 10, 22 through 24. Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Time is running out, brothers and sisters. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 through 10. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is Hebrews chapter 11, 1 through 10. This is what the ancient were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. We talked about last week about giving our best, that the woman with the sinful nature was giving her best, doing her best. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in him, keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them. Luke chapter 8, 40 through 56. Let's turn there. Luke chapter 8, 40 through 56. This is the story that we just talked about so that we understand. He starts with the parable in chapter 8 of the sower, parable of the sower. Now understand, Jesus is in Capernaum, like we said, and the crowds of people are gathered all around him. So you can start reading in chapter 8 after this Bible study. Go back and read the parable of the sower. As he's going through this crowd, he's explaining about the parable of the sower. I'll just read in chapter 8, verse 4. While a large crowd was gathered and people were coming to Jesus from town after town, he told this parable. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path. It was trampled on, and the birds ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, and when it came up, the plants withered because they had no moisture. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up with it and choked the plants. Still other seeds fell on good soil. It came up and yielded a crop 100 times more than was sown. This is the state of mind that Jesus was in. He was planting seeds. He was in these crowds. He was trying to get them to understand the difference of the soil. These were all farmers. These were all people that were had their hand to the plow, that were in the working the ground. This is how they were. This is their lifestyle. So he's trying to talk to them about the seeds. As he works, as he's going through this crowd, then he comes to chapter 8, 40, and this is our story. And now that we've talked about her, let's read it slowly. Luke chapter 8, 40, Jesus raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. Like, what are you talking about? Everybody's touching you. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that the power was gone out from me. The power of the Lord. We've got to understand that power of the Lord. It demonstrates God's power and authority over nature, sickness, and the unseen world. His power and authority over darkness and evil. His power over death and life. God has the power to heal, deliver, and transform our lives if only we reach for him in truth, true faith, and believe that he is the one and only answer, the healer, the almighty, and can do all things. The unnamed woman with the issue of blood believed that Jesus was her answer, her savior, her redeemer, her father. So he asked, "Who touched me?" Someone touched me. I know that power was gone from me. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." But hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She's not dead, but asleep." Like, stop this nonsense. They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead, but he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. God is omnipotent, all powerful. He's omnipresence. He's present everywhere. And omniscience. He's all knowing. Omnipresence is God's ability to do anything without limitations or restrictions. Omnipresence is God's presence in all places at all times. And as we studied last week, how Jesus knew what the Pharisee was thinking about the unsaved woman with the sinful life, we know that he knows our every thought too. Omniscience is God's complete knowledge of everything, past, present, and future. God just gives us two commands and a promise. Don't be afraid. Just believe, and you will be healed. You will be washed eternally, not externally, because our Jesus died on the cross, as we read, and his blood covered us. We no longer had to be sprinkled with calf's blood and the sanctuary sprinkled, because like he said, he doesn't have to die over and over again. He's died once, but he will be coming back, and we are to be washed and purified eternally for his coming. Kaylee, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
Nope.
I thank you for making that point clear about the law was given by God and it was for their instruction. They didn't do anything wrong. It just seemed extreme things that they had to go through. And like Kaylee said, thank God that we don't have to go through that as women. But this is where the woman with the issue of blood was, and she fell underneath those laws. And she adhered to those laws, and she had to have felt very isolated from her community. And as we all have our community, whether it's our Zoom Bible study group or our physical church that we attend, we have our community. Imagine the leprosies and the women that had to be isolated, this woman, for 12 years from her community.
And she had faith and all of that, to make it through the crowd to get to him. And she also, it doesn't say it, but she potentially was sacrificing and she probably could have been stoned if she was pointed out that she was there, and she could have made I'm unclean to make people part, so she could have just gotten up there. But that would have also drawn attention, and she, depending on the law, I mean, I'd have to look into that, but potentially she could have been stoned, or killed or hung or, whatever for just being there. And so she, just like the lady we talked about yesterday, the sinful woman, just sacrifice, if I go trying to meet my savior, let it be
let it do whatever it takes to get to him. That's the whole point. Do whatever it takes to reach him.
Yep.
Amen. Do whatever it takes. Go ahead, Zoom. Sorry about that. All right. We'll see you next week, Tuesday, 9:00 a.m. We're on Zoom afterwards to talk a little bit more about the study. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week at 9:00. Bye-bye.